Welcome to this week's solo show. I thought I'd do a little article based on a blog that I did a few months back called Keep It Simple, and you can find this on the blogspot.com, making money from music.blogspot.com. So keep it simple. I did back in October, and the opening phrase of this was something that has been sort of puzzling me for a while. I mean, we still get this played on us that it's a great idea to have a lot of choice, and I sort of thought about this quite a lot with teaching, and it sort of seems evident that that is not the case. And this article started off with this quote. It said, it's been clear that choice is not what it's cracked up to be. Choice was always the flagship of marketing, whether it's the number of TV channels or treatment options for health or what we can buy in a supermarket. But in reality, it's become a curse. We're drowning in choice, and it leads to confusion and lack of decision, and certainly contributes directly to the lack of staying power required to learn. Now, I was thinking about this, but when I started learning the guitar back in the 1970s, there wasn't any choice at all about where you could go for lessons, because the nearest guitar teacher to me was in the next town, and he was a classical guitar teacher. There certainly wasn't anybody teaching electric guitar that I knew of, even though there were some people actually playing it. There wasn't somebody that you could have said, oh, definitely go to this person for lessons. And I had to find this guy through a friend of mine. It was actually very sort of convoluted. It was a friend who changed schools, and then it was a friend of a friend. But the point was that the information that you were given, along with stuff that you worked out from records that were slowed down on an old record player, that was all you had. So subsequently, you learnt everything that you could find, because there wasn't an awful lot available. Subsequently, you got very good at the small amount of information available. Now, because of choice, there is so much stuff out there that you're absolutely drowning in it. You're not actually getting those things under your fingers unless you limit what it is that you're actually learning. Now, this sort of flies in the face of everything that goes in this sort of modern society that we're in. And I thought, with regarding to learning musical instruments, there's so much stuff that how can you possibly know it all? You have to start somewhere and get good at that, and then start to build. I used the sort of template of learning a language. If you think how children learn a language, it's just picking up the odd word here and there and listening and being aware. You don't actually, as a child, have hundreds of words. You get one or two, and you play around with those one or two words. You get them wrong, you get the way that the syntax fits together incorrectly, and gradually over time you refine that, and then it starts to really develop. And I think that that is the natural way that we learn a language and learn, if you think of music as a language, how we learn music. Now, I've noticed with people that have lessons, or the people that come to me for lessons, they don't seem to have that sort of level of depth. They could have a lot of breadth in what they know, but there's no depth in what they do unless you supply that depth. I don't think, with the amount of information that's available, that people do that. I think they just go wider. Now, the problem with that, as far as I'm concerned, is it seems unnatural. And when you listen to people who play, and you go back to the old players, they certainly had a lot of depth in what they did. So, for instance, if you think of a player like Muddy Waters or John Lee Hooker, you couldn't say that they had great technique, because they didn't. Lots of players didn't have great technique at all, but what they played resonated with the person that listened. Now, I'm not so sure, in fact I'm convinced that that's not what's happening now. So there seems to be, with a lot of pop music, obviously this is the classic example, that a lot of this stuff has absolutely no feeling. Now, some of it has a lot of impact. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but it doesn't actually make you feel connected to the person who's producing the music. So what I mean by that is, if you any form of art that has some sort of resonance for you, you could feel deeply connected with that artist, even if you don't know who they are. So for me, that would have been somebody like William Blake or Salvador Dali, who you became sort of like, as if they were you felt like they had a kinship to you, if that makes sense. And looking at music, it was the same thing. It was almost like you were part of a club. Obviously that was helped by the fact that when you bought an album, it was just one, maybe one that you'd bought that week. You hadn't heard hundreds and hundreds of different things. So for me, that started my sort of quest about what it was that was going on, what was different. I mean, there might be something in the success of people like Ed Sheeran, because the amount of stuff that he'd put up through social media of him playing with a looper pedal and all the rest of it, that gave you this idea that this guy was interesting, somebody that you would probably want to know. I mean, perhaps you don't feel so much about that now, but certainly in his early material, there was something very, very interesting about the guy. But I'm not so convinced with the sort of way that things are recorded now, where it's so highly processed. There seems to be something incredibly lacking in lots of music, not in everything, but in lots of stuff. So my point that I'm making here is, does that contribute to the way that people would take your music on board? That there's something real about it, something that resonates with it. And I think, excuse me, that comes from the sort of depth, the realness of what it is that you do. So the next point that I raised in this comes down to the very simple concept of marketing, of supply and demand, economics, basic sort of economics. It's obvious that when something's scarcer and it's in demand, the value goes up. And of course, if you look at what's going on at the moment with things like YouTube and all the rest of it, it's like a race to the bottom. It's just, let's give everything away for nothing. And the whole thing seems to be predicated on people having their intellectual copyright sort of given away for nothing. Things like Spotify, to some extent what goes on with iTunes. I think it's really important, not necessarily from the point of view of people having to pay for something, but for things to be more scarce Because again, this idea of massive choice and all the rest of it just means a devaluation in what's actually out there. That's obviously sounds a bit Luddite, but I think a lot of musicians feel the same way about that. Now, one other aspect, interestingly, information. You know, we get this sort of thing that it's the information age, blah, 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 blah. If you think about how powerful information could be, it could be the thing that makes the difference between you being poor and being rich. For instance, if somebody came up with the cure for a life-threatening condition, let's say it's cancer, let's say it's cancer of the breast, and they weren't shut down with their knowledge, and it was a simple, provable way of curing cancer that has been proven by the fact that they've survived it themselves and their close relatives have survived cancer. Now, keeping all the other thing of big pharmaceutical companies out of it, technically speaking, that bit of information would mean that that person effectively could become unbelievably rich, because there is a demand and he is the only person with that information. So you have a scarcity and you have a demand. Okay. So, if that's put up on the internet, think about what that would mean. It would totally devalue that information. It would become literally worthless, because some people wouldn't believe, it would be sort of ridiculed, the big pharmaceutical companies would come in and it would just disappear. And I think that is exactly what's going on within the world of music. Everybody can put their music online, which means that it doesn't become worth anything. In fact, this was predicted by Jacques Attali in his book Noise, which I recommend that you get and read, because if anybody was able to predict the future, this man was astonishing. And it was all predicated on the idea that there would be too much information out there. And because of that, everything would become devalued. Now, next thing. When I started off, guitars were really expensive. And you really had to struggle to afford one. And you started off with whatever cheap old rubbish there was, and you stuck at it with an instrument that was barely playable. You ended up with incredibly powerful fingers. So when you eventually got a decent guitar, it was easy to play. Now, I'm lucky enough to teach in public schools. Nobody's short of money, fortunately for me. But the downside is that these kids who've got everything effectively don't have anything, because they could just do something else tomorrow. Now, that's not true in all cases, but it's true in a lot of cases. And I had a very interesting experience as a young musician at the age of, I don't know, 20 or so. And I was involved in a band with the son of a very famous actor. In fact, he was a film star. And we had an incredible band with a record contract with EMI, but it needed more funding, because the original contract was just for this guy who was the singer, and he wanted to expand the size of the band. And we produced some material which was really good, and we had a lot of people interested. Lots of major TV programs, chat shows and stuff, were interested in getting this guy Jeff on board, along with his famous father and his sister, and it was all ready to go. And he had a slight substance problem, which landed him in hospital, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. But what was interesting was that a friend of mine who was running the studio that we did a lot of the demos in said to me, unfortunately, he could wake up tomorrow and decide to be a racing driver. So, he had too many choices. And that sort of stuck with me, because he had talent. The band was amazing, and but the point was that he didn't have to do it. He could have done something else, which is exactly what had happened, because his father paid for a couple of very expensive restaurants in London, one in Mayfair, which he then took over, and with some help of some top class restaurateurs, made a very successful business out of it. Yeah, which was fine, but that's actually not what he wanted to do, because he did have a great voice and he wanted to be a musician. But there we go. So from my own experience, at the time it was all very bewildering, because I couldn't see what was happening. I was only young. But there we go. So the next time you look at stuff and somebody tries to tell you this is magnificent because you've got so much choice, tell them to go and stick it, and look for the scarcity. So if you're trying to develop yourself as a musician and you decide that you want to be a electric guitar player, find one style and get really good at it before you then start to branch out to do other things. So get good at the first thing, the core of your playing. Okay? And if you want to make a choice about what that's going to be, look at where you're going to make the most impact. Okay, so that probably won't be heavy metal, because it's a little niche market with a lot of people in it. So look at something that's got a little bit more scarcity in the suppliers to the demand. So basic economics: be a big fish in a small pond. Okay, but where there's a lot of people that would be interested in visiting your pond. So the last point that I raised, in fact there was a couple of stories in this article. One of them was about Joe Satriani. Apparently somebody comes to Joe Satriani for guitar lessons. This guy could play solos by the band Anthrax, which astonished him. But when Satriani sort of asked him about the chords that he could play, this chap didn't even know what E minor was. Now, I've had a lot of experiences, people turning up and playing bits of Eddie Van Halen's, Eruption solo and all the fingerboard tapping, without actually knowing what that is. So this was in sort of the early days of the sort of availability of stuff online, and now of course it's got 100 times worse. You really do need to go so deep with this. So for instance, if you're looking at that Van Halen solo, you've got to be able to then take the ideas and apply them somewhere else, which is what we did, to get the core of the language, the syntax. And you've got to remember that the old rock and roll and blues players didn't actually know very much, okay? But what they knew deeply. So this would not just apply to guitarists, it would also apply to saxophone players. The early jazz players had their set of standards, and back in the day, that might have been 50 songs, and that was it. Obviously, as things got more and more developed in the world of jazz, that set of standards would have gone up to 200-300 songs. But they would have been sets of patterns that they would have recognised. So there could have been 10 songs with the same chord progression. The point is, they knew that subject matter deeply. Okay. Whereas now, there is so much stuff out there, not just even within the world of music, but the kids that are learning to play guitar, they spend far too long, obviously, on things like computer games and what have you. I mean, you can't do that if you want to get your 10,000 hours in. It's as simple as that. If you want to get 10,000 hours of music in, you've just got to be playing music. And that sounds incredibly old-fashioned, and it is, because that is the fact of the matter. If you want to be that good, you've got to find as much time as you can to learn the things that you know. And I mean really learn them. So that you don't have to look at a piece of paper. It's literally in your fingers. And you could play them in your sleep. So that's the sort of depth that you could go to. So, keep it simple, in as much that you've got a small amount of information that you know thoroughly. Because otherwise, you haven't got anything to hang this information on. Okay, that's your bedrock of your material. Okay, so, just to sort of wind up, you might be saying, well, what about the old libraries? I mean, there've always been libraries packed with information, packed with books. Yes, but you had to read first, okay? You had to know what that stuff was about first, before then you could go and find interesting stuff about, in some sort of old tome somewhere. Same with music. Once you've got the basics down in depth, then you can start to broaden what you've got, but not before. Okay. So that's the way I would sort of answer that question. Okay, so just to wrap up, for those of you interested in other aspects of what I'm doing, there's a Patreon page that's sort of developing now. If you're interested in that, you can just contact me through this information down below the podcast on YouTube. You can contact me www.vichyland.com. I have a Facebook page. There's probably only me, called Vic Hyland, so I wouldn't, worry. You should be able to find me quite easily. The Patreon page is going to have a lot of the information about the guitar grades and getting yourself going and building a business through music. That's all going to be available there. The Blues Camp Summer Schools, there's one running in France this year. There's one running in the UK in Tunbridge, which we've done for the last 12 years. For information on that, you want to go to www.bluescampuk.co.uk, and information for both of those are available there. The France one, at the moment, we've got 2 spaces left. So Tunbridge, there's about half a dozen places, I believe. So hurry along for that as well. It's brilliant. 3-day session in the UK, so that's really good fun. So that's it for today. Speak to you again soon, and have a good week.